He earned his master's degree from Fuller Theological Seminary in MDiv and Arizona State University in MA in Sociology at MLST. Everyone, please welcome John Caleb-Collins.
Yes, good evening everyone, and thank you St. Francis in the Valley for inviting me to be here, and thank you to Father Ward and Father Nelson, Deacon Becky, and all others who I just met for your hospitality. Hospitality, in fact, is going to be a major part of the conversation tonight because in my experience on the border, borders are performed and learned through performance. They are lived experiences rather than lines that have to be fixed. And a part of making borders permeable and making borders and communities come together is hospitality and friendship like we shared tonight. So thank you all so much. As I said, tonight I want to talk about my experience living on the border in Bisbee and Douglas, Arizona, and learning about more how the border is an experience place. It is an area where the cultures of Mexico and of the United States and of pre-Hispanic cultures as well as post-Hispanic and U.S. period cultures meet together. In the midst of all of our fierce political debates, I am not here to convince anyone of a particular partisan position or to tell you for whom to vote. Merely, I am here to say that in the midst of that, we often forget that there are people who are exiled from lands they once inhabited, and we do not think about borders as being a performance. We think about national borders as geological reality, but they are less a part of our fixed geography, given that they do not exist naturally. So for us as Christians, we say God does not create the borders from the beginning. We do. So the question is, what do we value? Who do we value? And it is our values that are lived that create our experience of the border. After more than a year of living in southern Arizona, along northern Sonora, the major adjustment for me has been acclimating to the fluid experience of what a border is. And in that acclimating, I learned that I was living within both borders as someone who grew up bicultural, Hispanic and Anglo, and living on borders that exist in our hearts and ideas of the borders that we bring with us. So when I was completing my liberal studies program at Arizona State University, it was also my first year serving as vicar in 2020. So in the middle of a pandemic, I was learning to journey through the borders of cyberspace along with you all as we learned how to do Zoom meetings and online classes and online church service, which I did not think we would ever do the way we did. So the question for me during my program was looking at different epistemologies, that is, sources of information and truth that we don't normally look at. Here in the church as Christians, we probably have asked, what is our source of truth? We might first say God being the source of truth and the ground of being, or we might, if we go to our Sunday school and catechism answers, we might say the written word of God is our source of truth, or a written epistemology. But in my program at Arizona State University, I focused on performative epistemologies or oral tradition, dancing, lived experiences, cooking, and we don't always think of those as sources of information and truth for our lives. And that is sometimes difficult to adjust to, but that's what I have experienced so far. So my opening question for all of you, and you can take some handouts home. I don't know that we pass out enough, but we do have some extras printed if you'd like to take one home. The opening question is one for all of us to think about during this night, and I hope during the rest of our Lenten season and even our lives. Does language shape the landscape, or does landscape shape the language? In other words, do we come with our own set of values predetermined and tell the land what it is, where it is, and to whom it belongs? Or is our language shaped by the landscape itself? Do the rivers, the mountains, the localities of villages, does that inform the landscape? Does that inform our language? First, an introduction to some communities along the border as we think about our own set of values and whether it is our language, whether it is our presuppositions that tell us what the border is like, or whether it's the experience itself telling us. Some communities along the border to think about. This is an oversimplified presentation of those communities because within each of these there is diversity. So recognizing that, in general, we are the United States and Mexico. On the United States side and the Mexican side, you have both of these communities made of US citizens and nationals and Mexican citizens and nationals. And to show us a little bit of insight into the Arizona side of the border, I drew on some information from the United States 2020 census to show how, one, things have changed, how things have evolved culturally in our society. And you can see here in Cochise County that 65.2% of people identify as white or Anglo alone. 34% is Hispanic and or Latin of any race. And almost 4% is American Indian or Alaska Native. And in Santa Cruz, the most heavily Hispanic and Spanish-speaking county, which is right next to us in Cochise County, and the next one over for me and traveling the border, is 83.1% Hispanic and Latin of any race, 33.4% white and Anglo alone, and about 1% American Indian or Alaska Native. So these are just some statistics to show what the demographics of the area looks like for us. So I said that I was going to talk a little bit about my experience with language and how language shapes our own view of the border. Let us think for just a moment about maybe the first time we've heard about the border. I'm not asking for anyone to raise their hands and share, have to call on someone and share a particular experience. But I just want us to think, it's the first time we heard about the border in an ad on TV. It's the first time we've heard about the border on a documentary on television. Was it reading and following a map? Was it being told by your family? Where was the first time you were told or became aware in your life that we as a country have borders with other countries and that we have distinctions? Well, one thing I have learned is that the closer you get to what we call a border, you start to notice that the language is much more permeable, that is, it is much more open when discussing the border. The perception of it is a lot different than, say, if we were to live in New York City, where we're closer to the northern Canadian border, but far enough away and in a dense enough population where maybe that is not thought of except for as like an abstract faraway place that maybe you see in an ad. But the closer you get to living on the US-Mexican border, you think of it less as a concept, less as that line on the map, and you look out and you ask yourself, well, where does it start and where does it end? Now we do have a wall that has been built so we can in some places see where the border begins and ends, but even then, we have cities such as Naco, Sonora and Naco, Arizona that were once one city, sharing one name, where you can see it from a bit of a distance and it still looks like one city, and especially at night, when you take away the light of day where we can clearly distinguish the landmarks, at night you look out and it just looks like one city together because they are that close, they were one city. Part of how I think our language impacts us is I noticed that when speaking in Spanish and engaging with my Spanish-speaking congregants, there was a tendency to speak about the border differently, not so much as if it existed, but just referring to all the areas by their own name, not referring to it as crossing the border, but simply as saying, I'm going to that city. And it makes sense as you look that the closer you get to our border, you see that the population of Spanish speakers increases. This has increased since 2000, but this is the last time that they released a helpful graphic that I wanted to share with you. But still in Santa Cruz today, over 80% speak Spanish, and in my county, 25%. and in Pima County, 22.8%. The closer we get to these bilingual communities, we start to see that the border itself is bilingual and bicultural. It is not a hard line where you cross over to one side and everyone speaks English, and you cross over to the other side and everyone speaks Spanish. It's not like you cross to one side and there's violence, and you cross to one side and there's peace, or vice versa. There's crime on both sides. There's peace and community on both sides. And so what this map does for us is to show the fluidity of the trying to use language to determine borders. Rather than a solid line, the cultural shifts represent a gradient. The most fixed concrete borders are those that exist in our hearts and minds when looking at a map, and when we are furthest from the borderlands. The closer we get to borders, whether they are geographic or in our hearts, the more permeable and transmissible the cultures are to one another. We also, of course, want to recognize that we are on land that belongs to traditional peoples, and for us, where we are at, this is just a helpful map to show that we are still on land populated and traditionally stewarded by indigenous American communities. And in Sonora, Mexico, the federal government does not recognize Native American nations the same way that we do here. It is quite different. There is not necessarily a citizenship registry. That does not mean that there are not Native American people on the Sonoran side just across our border. Indigenous communities have existed in Arizona for thousands of years. And according to the book, Hopi Places, from Klein Library at Northern Arizona University, the oldest continuous settlement, village, or town is Orabi, or Orabai, I hope I pronounced it correctly, but Orabai in the Hopi Nation, which was founded sometime at or before 1100 BC. So indigenous, and it's here in Arizona, in the Hopi Nation. So this is before European nation-state models came and drew the borders under that model. But we are more interlinked with cultural exchange than we realize. Language familiarity and landscapes determine the names of places in many indigenous, and in most indigenous American languages. For example, my Tatas family came from their home in San Miguel de Bavispe in Basarac, Sonora, which was a part of the Opateria, or where the Opata indigenous people had traditionally lived. And you can see how landscape, how looking and leaning on the land to inform us as a source of truth, and living there in, living there in an ecological relationship, living there as part of the land, how that affects language. And you can see that in the names that survive. Most of the Opata language is now extinct because of colonization, but some of the language survives in place names, including Basarac, which means where water is seen, and Babispe, or where water flows. How do the communities talk about the border? This was important for me as the vicar in Bisbee and in Douglas, as I'm serving communities that talk about the border quite differently than I grew up with. I grew up with talking about the border in the context of, seeing the same political ads from all kinds of parties, political parties that we all do, and hearing about the border as a fixed place, is this line in the sand that needed to be fixed and fortified. But like I said, as I immersed myself in the communities in Bisbee and in Douglas, people just don't talk about it that way. They talk about the space we call the border differently. And in my experience, so I'm only speaking through my experience because the perspectives are much more broad and inclusive than this, but from my experience on the border, I identified 3 broad spheres of influence in how we talk about and conceptualize the border. There is an intersection of cultural understandings. So I mentioned that gradient in that map showing that the closer you got to our US-Mexican border, the more Spanish speakers were also on our side. Now the reverse is true in Mexico. The closer you get to the US border, the more bilingualism with English and Spanish you see too. So languages, in a way, shape the border. And being there, I found that there are three primary cultural spheres that influence how we talk about the land. There's the indigenous or pre-Hispanic cultures, with more of a transnational outlook on borders. Think, for example, of the Tona Odom Nation, which is a nation on both sides. You may have heard of this in the news because it was part of a major debate in building the border wall, whether or not the border wall could be built on land belonging to the Tona Odom Nation as a Native American nation recognized by the US, because they continue into Sonora. There are the Spanish or Hispanic and post-Hispanic cultures, but still pre-United States cultures. The missions tended to be the focal point for demarcating where the land was and to whom it belonged. So if you saw Spanish missions and the haciendas around them, you were able to identify where you were. And also the concept of el mestizaje. El mestizaje is the concept, perhaps you have heard of people identifying, like my family did, as mestizo, or an admixture of cultures. A living permeability of cultures where the Spanish and the pre-Hispanic cultures are still lived in people who identify and grow up as mestizo, and generally they are seen as half European and half indigenous American. That's one sphere of influence, and it's still very, very strong on the border. It is not uncommon to meet curanderos, or people who act as spiritual leaders within a mestizo or indigenous American community along the border, who still blend some of the Christian practices, especially Catholicism, with pre-Christian traditions and pre-Christian rituals. We also have the influence of the English language and how the United States came to acquire Arizona and these borderlands. This land was acquired by the United States through annexation. And because of the military conflict and because of the war that was fought to take the land, as well as the annexation of land that was ceded by Mexico, though not willingly, was that we ended up with very fixed boundaries. And to me, we can go all the way back to the arrival of the Spanish conquistadors to see that the conflict and the desire to possess the land for the self over against the claims of traditional peoples of the land was where we first saw that journey towards the fixed borders we have today. So that's where we end with annexation. In annexation, the land is treated like a real estate transaction, where fixed boundaries are important. And this is where I argue that we see that the assumption of one language, the English language, ends, and we can see another begin, Spanish on the Mexican side. So to give some examples of what I mean, because you might be thinking, okay, well, you've talked about language, and you've talked about how language impacts the way we speak of the border, and are we looking at the landscapes informing how we talk about where we are, or are we sitting far away and assigning labels to a place far away? So you're probably wondering, well, what are some examples of that? Well, when I first arrived as vicar, I have to be honest, one of the first things I had to experience was learning that most people whom I have met do not say, are you going to the border today? Are you going to cross the border today? Our junior warden, a wonderful junior warden, she's given me permission to share this. She is Anglo. Her name is Jackie Fagan. And she represents what I believe is a synthesis of an English-dominant, but still Spanish-integrated cultural system, meaning that there's still some permeability, there's still a sense that we are not divided by a fixed line. Jackie likes to ask me, are you going across the line today? Or if I ask her, where is one of our employees who happens to live on both sides? It's very common for people to have a home on both sides and to be either a US citizen, Mexican national, dual citizen, or a Mexican citizen and US national or green card holder. So they often own homes on both sides. And she will ask, is she across the line today? Or if I ask her where our custodian is, she may answer, oh, she went across the line, she'll be back in about an hour. It's not seen as she took her passport, she got into the line, and she's going to the border. We don't discuss the length and the complexity that we now have in trying to cross, since the ports of entry are much, much more restricted. They still refer to it as across the line. But what struck me when I arrived is one of the first times she told me this, and this is where it really struck at my heart, and this is where, if nothing else, I hope I impart the emotion to you today, is we had our Stations of the Cross. There were several moments where we had interruptions right in the readings where it says, no help came from God for Jesus. Almost an interruption, because we don't expect that, right? We catch ourselves realizing Jesus, who is God, is going to die. Now, we know he's going to rise again. But if you're walking to Golgotha with the people whom we have read and prayed about today, you might not be so sure in that moment as you see what Jesus is going through. So there was an interruption that cut into my heart as she was talking. She said, I used to like to go across the line. Oh, it's not really a line anymore. The border wall, I mean. Because she said that what happened was, instead of being able to go down one of the roads she was accustomed to see her friends and to have barbecues and picnics, which I have to say, I feel the experience, it was robbed from me because only shortly before the wall was built, a few years before my arrival, people still walked across on those dirt roads or those, barely paved roads to have barbecues and picnics together. And many prayer services and church services were done with holding hands in a circle across the border, which at that time was just a fence, and not even a complete fence, just the posts with the wire to just designate this is where the border is. When she caught herself and said, oh, I mean the border wall, it had the sense that she's not going to be doing that anymore. It had this sense of an end to an experience she had. It had this sense of someone far away was telling them, you were wrong this whole time in how you saw this. It's one of those interruptions that can cut into our heart because we wonder, is this permanent? But we're Easter people. So we're people of resurrection. And again, I'm not telling you what your opinion needs to be on the border wall, but what I am saying is we need to find a way to get back to community, whether that is with the wall there or with it not there. Either way, we need to get back to community, and we need to get back to saying, let's go across the line. Because nothing else should separate us as human brothers and sisters created in God's image. For our Spanish speakers, it was interesting. Most people do not say the Spanish equivalent, which would be cruzar la línea, to cross the line, or cruzar la frontera, cross the border. Most of the time, I have heard our Spanish speakers simply say, vamos a Naco. We're going to Naco. They don't even distinguish Naco, Arizona or Naco, Sonora, because it is one community. That's still hard for me to wrap around, is that whenever I mention Naco, Arizona and Sonora, people sometimes will actually remind me, no, we're one community. This is new to us, this hard separation. So in Spanish, you rarely hear that, cruzar la frontera, or a cruzar de la línea. Instead, you hear people referring to the name of the place, indicating familiarity and an expectation of being able to cross and of unity. It's like when you name your friend. If you name your friend's house, there's an expectation that this is familiar. You say, I'm going to Joe's house or to Mary's house. There's this sense of familiarity. We don't often say that if we go say in the airport and we have to cross the security line before we get food. We say that. I have to get through security first before I can get my food. That's not familiarity. So that's maybe a real world way we can think about how the difference between how people are talking about the border. That the further away you are and come from, maybe you didn't have that experience like I didn't. You think of it as a security line because that's how it has manifested now. But people who have lived there their whole lives, especially in the Spanish language, just say, I'm going to Agua Prieta. Or even more simply, I'm going to AP today. And we know nicknames, right? Hopefully you give your friends nice nicknames. I know sometimes we don't, but you give your friends nicknames. And this is a picture here of some artwork in Naco. That's the official city sign as you enter. And you can see the courtyard is a beautiful courtyard, which is another barrier broken down, I think, in our hearts, because we can get stuck seeing images on television of the chaos in different refugee and migrant camps and not see the everyday patterns of life that, quite frankly, are just like here, with the same hopes and dreams and expectations. So this is one of my favorite pictures, because Naco, in the indigenous languages, including Nahuatl, means the prickly pear, the fruit of the prickly pear. Just as nopal means the cactus itself, Naco refers to the fruit. And so you will see this symbol all over for Naco, as it is one of their symbols, as that is what their town on both sides is named after. Well, we get, I think, to a place where, in my experience of the area and while I was doing my research at Arizona State University, that when I read about indigenous sources of epistemology or truth or experiences of the environment, natural landmarks tended to shape how the land is viewed and to decide, where you might go from one place to another. Instead of crossing the border or even going to a different city, you might experience it as this is in the older Pueblo cultures that used to inhabit, like the Hohokam in Phoenix, where people built along the rivers, where the river began and ended, determined where your cultural sphere of influence was, because water, as we know as Arizonans in the desert, is life. But we're often shielded from having to think about the border issues in water. And you may wonder, just like with language, well, what do you mean water now is a border issue? What, is that really a border issue? And the answer is yes, because what I'm showing you here is the San Pedro River. And the San Pedro River is first of all one of the few north-flowing rivers, and it flows from south to north, and it flows from Sonora, Mexico, to Arizona. And one of the difficulties that we have had is this is a major source, the San Pedro Basin is a major source of water for the traditional peoples of the land, the indigenous American communities, as well as for all of the US and Mexican citizens on both sides, all of us of any background. Because this is a major source of water, it actually became quite contentious with the building of the border wall and this fixed permanent structure, because the border wall had to be built right across the San Pedro River. And so they did build it, and now it cuts the river in two. As you can imagine, this has interrupted the biodiversity. And just in case people didn't know this, if you travel, and I encourage you to do it, to the San Pedro, when you enter, it looks almost like a small rainforest in the middle of an Arizona desert when you enter the tree line, because you'll see water like this in different places. And it's an underground river, so you can walk across most of it, as long as it's not flooding. Don't go when there's flash flood signs, because it really can fill up. But as an underground river, we can visit and hike along its banks and even in the riverbed to see the incredible biodiversity. But it is the most biodiverse place in Arizona and one of the most biodiverse ecosystems in the world. What are borders to those critters that live there, God's creation? The water and the river is their border. They don't know that we have in our mind, that they don't know that we have an idea of what should belong to our country and what should not. And yet a wall is built. One of the ramifications of that has been the endangered beaver population is going extinct. It's possible they may already be extinct, as some observers have said they have not documented them recently, but not enough time has lapsed to determine whether or not they are extinct. But the San Pedro beaver, native to Arizona and this river, may already be extinct because the wall was built through it and they can no longer travel back and forth. That affects your ability to find food if you cannot have access to your whole habitat. There's a beautiful tradition in both the Hispanic as well as in the indigenous American cultures of the area, in the Nahuatl language and in the Opata traditions, from where my Tata derived his heritage. There is a tradition with a Spanicized word called La Corua. La Corua refers to a river spirit, a river guardian that is a giant snake. And you can see here a picture of what La Corua would look like, which, as you can see, looks a lot like following the pattern of the river with the trees growing up around it. You know, my tata told a story about the power of a river. If people can talk about going across the line, and we can examine and look at the indigenous and the synthesis of indigenous and Mexican worldviews on ecology and the border here, especially in La Corua, we can gain a deeper understanding of the human experience with our own ecology. You see, La Corua plays a special role. This guardian snake, as it winds through the desert earth, creates a river with its own life force, becomes the protector of that river, and as long as the Corua continues to live, the river remains alive. The tradition is that when a Corua is killed, such as by overuse of water or cutting through the river, so literally cutting through the heart of the guardian serpent, the river dies too. And so the tradition was, if you see a river, the common phrase was, that is because La Corua there has died. Somebody killed or something killed the Corua. Water and life are interconnected. Water and life form the borders that grow in our hearts, and we are the ones that draw the maps. Water represents fluidity and permeability, just as baptism, the waters of baptism, show us crossing over from the death of sin to the life of Christ resurrected. Water represents this fluidity, this transmissibility, a journey. So developing cultural life in this area was built on survival traits and has been shared by the US period and by the still existing Pueblo cultures and by the Hispanic settlements that continue to exist in the area. So this is one where I would like to share a poem I wrote, and I promised then we have questions. This is it. Here we go. So this is a poem I wrote during my time at ASU on La Corua, or the guardian serpent. I will say it in English and in Spanish. La Corua, primordial protector of rivers, serpentine motion of the water, greenery flourishes along your banks, avian song bursts abundantly. The ancients treasured your purpose, created by the Great Spirit to guard life. Water, the divine gift. Bulldoze, great metal shifts. A wall, a cruel sword cuts your path. Straining, weeping, tread upon by those who say, don't tread on me. But upon thee they tread, the Creator's faithful co-worker. When you are gone, rivers are no more. Water vanishes, life can grow no more. If only they said, don't tread on La Corua. La Corua, guardián vasporoso de las aguas, la serpiente, el fluir del río. La tierra enverdece por tu orilla. Al coro de las aves les das casa. Los antepasados te conocían bien. Creada por Dios para proteger el agua, el don divino. La derrumbe, construyendo, destruyendo, un muro, no una navaja cruel te hiere. Te clava casi en dos, riñéndose, gimiendo, pisoteado por los ingratos que les decían, sobre mí no pises, pero sobre vos te pisan, el fiel obrero creativo de Dios. El agua evanesce, verde, la tierra ya no está. Solo si hubiesen dicho, no pisar por La Corua. And that's all. Yes.
Is the wall you're referring to the one put up by the former president?
Yes, the border wall is the one that was constructed by the previous administration.
Why can't it be taken down?
It could be. It would have to be by an act of Congress or an approved executive decision by the current president. But I believe at this point it would probably require an act of Congress to do that. I want to make sure I honor time. Father Warren, how much time about do we have? Oh. Okay, well, that's more than I thought. I was thinking I was going to get 5 minutes now. You talked, you ask vicars, you ask preachers to come up, and then sometimes we catch ourselves, oh, I'm preaching again. Especially getting Sunday. Yes, please.
You talk about the beautiful river, but what about the pollution that is coming into our country from Mexico?
That is a problem.
Beautiful river.
Yes, that is a problem. Actually, because on the Mexican side, there's less environmental regulation. And so that does affect the river as it flows. And so for me, in my experience and in my research, when I put those together, I thought about how water does connect all of us. And that whether you're on this side of the river or on this side, what comes up or comes down is going to affect you. We all depend on it. So we have to think about how we are going to cross the line. It can look like this. And it can be, again, it can be with the border wall still up. It's been built, maybe it stays. I'm not here to tell us which way we have to go on that decision. But we do need to reach our hand out and be brothers and sisters and siblings in Christ, whether we are believers or unbelievers. So I do think that's an important thing. That is important to mention, that there are concerns on both sides. I unfortunately haven't been able to experience as much because of COVID on the other, what we call the other side or across the line, except for in Naco. And so I can't speak to those challenges. I can only speak to the challenges on our side. But in my research on the San Pedro River, through a mostly literary and liberal studies perspective, theological perspective, there is pollution flowing. So that is something that's important for us to know, and something that maybe we can consciously empower people across the line to clean and to move forward with. Yes.
What have you seen as the impact on people on both sides with the changes that have occurred on the border?
I have to admit that because of my situation, my privilege having grown up in Mesa, I don't feel affected because I did not get to experience before. But in what I have experienced through talking with people, one of the major obstacles is they're unable to visit family and friends as easily as they did before. It takes much longer to cross, and especially with COVID, it's much more difficult to get supplies back and forth as we share resources together. And another impact has been economically. Douglas is a very economically depressed city at this time. We struggle, actually, even with evangelism. Many people who come and who even become members of our church almost always tell me, but we're probably going to move to Tucson, or we're probably going to move to Phoenix, or we're probably going to move to Sierra Vista. That maybe is the closest, because the impact of less feasible migration back and forth has impacted the local economies, which really depend on the agrarian culture as well as on the hospitality services. And so there's less employees for that, and that has impacted the ability for them to sustain the jobs for people on the US side as well. I do send them to y'all though in Tucson. I tell them there are Episcopal churches in Tucson, okay? So if you ever meet someone from Douglas or Bisbee, now you know where they're from, and welcome them, okay? Because there are a lot moving up here. Yes.
What is the reaction in Mexico to the American expats who take over small towns in Mexico and kind of turn them into an annex of the U.S.?
Oh, I see. So that has not, in my experience, been something that has happened in Agua Prieta or in Naco, the only places right now that I have familiarity with. But I can tell you what the reaction is to the building, the construction of the wall on the U.S. side for security reasons, well, and taxpayer reasons. You know, I know that it is expensive to repair and change. We can't really touch it too much. I mean, you can't change it, you can't write anything on it. On the Mexican side, they have murals and paintings that if you stand far enough away, because the way the wall is built is so you can see through it, it's almost transparent. It has the effect of looking transparent in parts. So you can see through it, almost like a screen door. So if you're too close, you can't really see the mural, but if you stand far enough away where it looks like more of a wall, they have drawn murals of people holding hands with US and Mexican flags. And I wish I had included some of those pictures. But I've taken so many, I couldn't find them. You know, I have my iPhone and I had to pictures and pictures. But if you ever have the opportunity to go across Agua Prieta or Naco, and I hope that maybe the opportunity is with us sometime in St. Stephen's and Douglas and in St. John's Bisbee, you can see that. And some examples of how art has been used as a reaction, sort of a positive reaction, you know, taking something that many perceive as negative and making it a piece of art. We work with the Naco Wellness Institute. It actually was a Jubilee ministry of the Episcopal Church. So if you do get a chance to watch this movie, it's called Beyond Barriers. Beyond Barriers with Tom Carlson, who is Episcopalian, and he is a member of St. John's Episcopal Church in Bisbee, and we work with them. And there are several local artists in the area, and they've done murals for them too. And they're beautiful, with, you know, sunflowers in the sun and flags with both cultures together. In fact, in the beginning, maybe I can go back. There's one example of a piece of artwork. This one too, but let's go to the beginning. So this is in the Unity Wall in Douglas, Arizona. So you know, I want to emphasize that on both sides, people do love their country. I want to emphasize that. We love the United States, and on the other, across the line, we love Mexico. And so people actually, you know, very, very patriotic on both sides, and this is an example of a unity wall showing the US flag and the Mexican flag together with the Red Cross, and emphasizing the model of 2 cities, 1 community. I see no other questions, so I want to know, oh, I'm sorry.
I grew up on the northern Maine Canadian border, and it is like 2 different worlds. From what I grew up with there to what I'm living now, it's just amazing, the difference. And as I was telling my brother-in-law, we used to go across the line. And when he was in Vermont, he went across the line, and it's all changed down here.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like 2 different worlds.
And that is interesting to hear. You know, you also share an experience of across the line, because really the closer you are when the borders are open, it's a different experience. You don't see it as being, oh, I can't go over there. It's just a line, and oftentimes you have family and neighbors on both sides. Yes, sir. That's an excellent observation and sharing of feedback, because yes, very much so, we're talking about an experience of the border that essentially was not a border like we think of it today. It just was totally different. And in my experience traveling abroad, just another example, I studied abroad in Romania and went to an Episcopal Lutheran church. Not like our Episcopal Lutheran here. That's the church where the bishop was. And So I worshiped there when I was there, and as I walked in, I spoke Romanian, but then the pastor asked me if I spoke German, because I told her about my Lutheran background, and I said, most Lutherans don't in the United States, but I happen to speak some. And so we started just talking, and she preferred German, and I thought, okay. But then she started speaking in Hungarian to other people, and the closer you got to this border in Transylvania, you kind of realized from above, it looks like you can draw this map and go, okay, here's Hungary here, here's Romania here. But if we didn't have that map to see, the closer you got to one another, the more integrated the communities were. And you'd hear Hungarian, German, and Romanian spoken in the same place. And that was very similar, eerily similar to when I got here in Arizona. I felt, oh, I feel like I'm back on this other border. And that's what got me thinking. There's a, not universal as in we're all the same, but there's a universal human experience of wanting identity and of struggling to find out what that identity is. And that's how I see borders, as our language being lived out from our hearts and our minds, just trying to navigate a world where we want to know who we are. Why are we here? May I call on back here first?
I just want to make an observation. When I was younger and I was in Berlin and seeing the artwork on the West Berlin side with the top wire on the East Berlin side, I live, come down to this border, I'm not sure what side of the border I'm on. That's just something I did living in Hamburg, East and West Germany, and going to Berlin and seeing, this isn't my country, I thought. The country of Kingdom, what is supposed to be on the other side with the East Germans, the Russians, but now it's on this side. And I have a hard time dealing with that.
It can be jarring, regardless of where you are, right? It can be jarring to experience it, culture shock. It was a culture shock for me. And yes, I saw first, all right, we'll do, since you asked, I'll do back here and then you. Okay, go ahead.
Do you not feel that after 9/11 that everything changed on all of the borders?
I have to be honest, I was in 4th grade in 9/11. And so, I do remember, but I'll never forget the reaction that my parents had. So that's why I say, I'll be honest, I can't speak to that experience that you will have to share with your community. But I will never forget my parents' reactions and the real fear that they felt. And I do remember feeling their fear, the transference of their fear. And you know, when your parents, as a child, and your parents are scared, you know something's up. Because they're supposed to protect you, right? So if they're scared, well, what's out there? So I do remember that, and I do remember, you know, them having to talk about more security at airports, being afraid to go on airports. And I think that changed the whole world. And, you know, it changed a world that I was about to, well, not about to quite yet, but that was to change the world I was about to be old enough to really start to think about and enter, you know, confirmation, the age of reason, as we call it. Although I'm learning that there may be no age of reason because I continue to mess up and fall short, and I think I was supposed to learn that lesson. But I was getting, you know, to the point where I would be old enough to understand more about that, and I think it did change what was experienced by previous generations compared to what my generation grew up experiencing. Yes, sir.
Despite some of our ambivalence about our southern border, I think we all probably realize, particularly now, maybe more so than we did a month ago, about the importance of borders, and particularly the border between Russia and Ukraine. And there's a situation where the border is absolutely imperative to protect people and their freedom. And the fact that we're praying for those people every day, we cry for those people, it gives some meaning to the good thing about borders. You know, like most things, there are good things and bad things about anything that you have, whether it's limitations or freedoms. Freedoms to excess may not be that great.
Yes.
But borders to excess may not be that great. But certainly we must recognize particularly in that area, that border is very good.
Yes, and the conflict began in a region, Donetsk and Luhansk, which declared their independence, where there's a great and strong admixture of Ukrainian and Russian speakers. And so my presentation was primarily built around my experience so far in seeing just how much, we may not even realize it, but language really impacts our sense of the world. And to me, then we get back to what Jesus said, where Jesus said, you know, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And I know we often say, you know, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me. But we know as Christians those words can hurt us. And people in Ukraine and in Russia are experiencing that hurt, and we're praying for the people of Ukraine's independence. You know, and conversely, on the other side, the people of Poland have welcomed, you know, migrants and refugees. And, you know, I think the Episcopal Church is also using our Episcopal Service Corps and our relief fund to also help. And so we're a part of that too. And that's a part of what our ministry is. The ministries are in Douglas and Bisbee. We have, in Douglas, we have Frontera de Cristo, which is a Presbyterian Church USA program, and that means the border of Christ, which, since Christ has no borders, the idea is they go back and forth and help to resettle migrants and refugees. And then in Nogales, the Episcopal Church, our diocese, works very closely with Cruzando Fronteras, which is primarily set up by the ELCA, the Lutherans, but that the Episcopal Church participates in too. So it is incredible to think that, I mean, for me, I was thinking about how I did this research and presentation for ASU just over a year after I had been there, and we really, I think, are learning that our history classes that we take in high school and in university, they're important because we're seeing how where's Ukraine? What is this? Like, what are the languages spoken there? So thank you, sir, for mentioning that, because it actually, a lot of it goes down to language there as well. Yes?
I want to know if Father Warren, as a Canadian, how they feel about us. But you're a border also. And how is your border different than the Mexican border?
Oh, it's a very different border.
That's what I'm
Yeah.
saying.
So close.
Integrated. Well,
Since-
no, it's open.
Since 9/11, it has tightened up a bit, but generally, there's open, the borders are only in certain spots as far as where you cross. There's lots of spots you can just walk across, and
There's a lot of border towns.
Yeah.
They're one community.
Yeah.
It's like when it was mentioned about like crossing the line, it would be the same there. The border, I think, is just your federal term. Like, it has to be identified. It has to be manned. It has to be guarded.
there's a lot of freedom that does not exist then.
I think there's one difference, that you need a passport.
Yeah, well, the passport, you never needed a passport to cross over, just to go shopping on either side, for Americans or Canadians, but that was 9/11. 9/11 changed it.
9/11 changed that.
Before all you needed was your driver's license.
But a Canadian can come to the U.S. and stay here for 6 months, no visa. They just have to have their passport, and you just have to identify where you are.
You just
I'm
can't
not sure
come here
that's the same
as
in
a
Mexico.
priest.
What's that?
You just can't come here as a priest.
Oh.
Took a while. Took a while.
I won't talk about the immigration, it took a while, different situation.
But yeah, finger by finger.
Yeah.
But I think because Canada and U.S., like, Canada's culture is based on what happens in the U.S. Like, and we're all the same immigrants. Like, everybody settled and there were no borders. So, like, my grandfather was a Mayflower pilgrim, that I'm Canadian. So, it really, there was a lot of, and I'm sure the same in Mexico, but Mexico has more of that Spanish culture, whereas Canadian is international. Like, there's
British.
cultures from all over the world. British, French, German, and Ukrainian. Huge in Canada.
It has-
Huge community.
Yeah, Canada has the largest Ukrainian community outside Ukraine.
So, and our, you know, just like I'm imagining the US, they've opened the borders to Ukrainian refugees if they can come. There's a lot of families that are sponsoring their own thing, but they don't want to leave. So, very, just that you've got your southern and you've got your northern.
Becky.
I don't know if some of you have read Peg Bowden's books, but she lived in Tubac. She wrote a lot of books about the border, and she worked down at Keno, which we have done as well. And in one of her books, I can't remember which one, she's visiting with a young migrant Mexican boy, and they're looking at the border and having conversation. And the boy looks at her and goes, "Why do you build a fence to keep yourselves in? What are you afraid of?"
And I saw a question over here too.
Yeah, I grew up in Williams, Arizona, and the town was predominantly white, but there was a large Mexican community. And even in that little town, the Mexicans were relegated to one section. And I was fortunate to live right across the street from Mexican town. And my mother, God bless her, was a nurse anesthetist, and she walked all over town after work to take medical treatment to people who couldn't afford it. But growing up there, we also had Native American people and black people, and in school, we were all blended together. And that, I'm so grateful for that kind of history as a child. I was raised by a village, as Hillary Clinton said. Yeah. I mean, literally, because mother, we were Smitty's kids. Our last name was Smith. And everybody, in fact, when I married this guy, he had the Episcopal church in Williams, and one of the ladies that knew my mother at the hospital called him up and threatened him. And I was nearly 30 years old, and she said, "You better take good care of Smitty's daughter." That's the town I grew up in, and I'm so grateful for that.
Community.
Community.
Getting to community, I think, is where, that's the language of our hearts. Community. And it can change the way we talk about one another. And, you know, we can let the land and the people determine how we speak, rather than deciding up here and placing it before we get to know one another. And that's true in our culture right now for, gosh knows, politics. We have to listen to one another and get to know one another as community first before we can resolve differences. You know, we have to love one another and speak that language. I think I saw a hand. I just want to make sure I honor everyone's question. Yes?
So do you find more that it's like on the flip, like as someone that was in Michigan, right, I could cross the Canadian border whenever I wanted as well too, because you only had to be 19 in Canada. So, 8 years doing that. But
18 in Quebec.
ahora en español también, mis hijos también. So, you know, he estado estudiando ahorita. Pero, I don't consider, it's not that I don't consider Mexico my neighbors, but more when you're saying this language barrier, like we speak Spanish and I studied Spanish and I had to do that for years, there's still a distinction because I don't have family on the other side of the border, to where you're talking about these immigrants that come over and that was one, you know, big community and stuff. That doesn't necessarily hold true for Americans. And not that there's this divisive border, and what you touched on too for the protection reasons. I mean, Arizona is the #1 spot for child trafficking, right, across that border. So as a parent, there's, you know, when I was at the Nogales border in Sonora, we used to walk across, and when they tell me, oh, be careful, your daughter's got curly hair and your son's got blue eyes, don't do that, you know, so there's that fear there. We don't consider that a community of nothing against the people actually learn the language and embrace the culture, but when they come here, do you find that that's different? Like when you talk about people coming across
Where we
the way
are,
that an American would.
yes. Yes, I hear and receive your story as you're telling it, because we all experience it differently. And what I will say is where we are in Bisbee and in Naco on both sides and in Douglas and Agua Prieta, it is much more like a community exchange, because not so much that it's fluent bilingualism, but there's enough bilingualism that like Jackie, our secretary and administrator, and superheroes. Whoever's your administrators, remember they're superheroes, because I've learned that. They really are. She speaks enough Spanish to communicate with people, and they speak enough English to communicate with her, kind of using both. So where we are, it's a bit different. And so my again, rhetorical, I don't want to ask anyone to have to answer a question they don't want to. But my, kind of question would be like, if you have gone to Naco or to Agua Prieta before, and if ever there was an interest in going to Naco to visit, I know at least a couple of really good restaurants that I like, and I know churches we like to eat. So if ever, we organize something going to just have fellowship, sometimes that's a good experience to go, and it's sort of a non-anxious, non-judgmental space to just share food with one another from even across our line here, and then just get a little bit of an experience. But it really does feel more, for me, like it is a community. And I think where I was, with languages, is that the closer you get to the borders with those who, have established family and cultural ties, that's where it's more permeable. Those of us kind of raised in between have to acclimate to a whole new experience of the way they see the border. So I think the invitation is to come and see, like Jesus said, come and see. And of course, we also say, and taste that the Lord is good, because again, Christians have always been about food. So, thank you. And thank you, Father.
Thank you.
That was a great presentation. Thank you so much. And if anyone wants to talk to Father John before you leave, I'm sure he'll be happy to talk to you for a few moments. Next week, we have our bishop, Bishop Jennifer Riddell, who's going to be here. So please be here on time. And if you know anyone who wants to come and hasn't bought a ticket yet, I suggest you have them buy a ticket before the day of. Okay? Because they have to buy food, right? So please encourage them, if they want to come, buy their ticket several days ahead, and that gives Sandy and Mark a chance to buy the food. Okay? And again, Mark and Sandy, thank you, and your team for the food. Great stuff. Can everyone have a safe drive home, and we'll see you tomorrow, some of you.
I'm okay.